Our next speaker is Dr. Lubomyr Luciuk. He's a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Toronto in the Geography Department. He doesn't really need too much introduction. He may be familiar to most of you here as a specialist who's looked into the question specifically of Divisia Halychyna and Canadian immigration policy and also Allied immigration policy towards the Divisia. Dr. Luciuk.
I think we would all agree that my colleagues, my esteemed colleagues in the last few hours have presented very scholarly papers on the nature of collaboration, Ukrainian positions during World War II, various aspects of the nationalist movement, the liberation movement. I won't try to repeat what they've already said. I'm going to take a slightly different perspective, and deliberately so. There are some, and I've heard people say this already, who feel that, well, these are the Ukrainian positions and we know them, or these are the German records. What I propose to do, in fact, is look at how the Ukrainians were viewed by the other side of the world, as it were, by the British, who were most directly involved with the Divisia and with Ukrainian displaced persons, and then by the Canadian government. So in fact, what I will be doing is dividing my paper into two sections. The first section, in fact, dates to before the war, and will give you a kind of bird's eye view of how the British looked at Ukraine, the Ukrainian, as they called it, the Ukrainian question. The second section will then go on to discuss the Divisia Halychyna and its immigration experiences coming from Italy through England to Canada. I don't propose to repeat too much of the historical material you've already heard about the division. So first, the attitudes towards Ukraine and the Ukrainian problem. The reason I want to set this up for you is that I think the British policy towards refugees was in fact hatched in the pre-war period, in the way in which they viewed Ukrainians as a minority group in various East European countries and the Ukrainian national question as a whole. So in other words, the pattern that would subsequently govern the refugee policies of England was established much before the war even broke out. Canadian policy essentially follows the British. I think it's well understood by those of us who've looked at Canadian policy on a variety of issues that in fact the British would set the policy and the Dominions would more or less trot along. However, there is a distinct difference, and it was particularly evident when it came to dealing with the immigration question. As we all know, hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians had come to Canada before the outbreak of World War II, settling primarily in Western Canada, and so the Canadian government and its various departments were very well aware of, as it were, the qualities and characteristics, the suitability of Ukrainians as immigrants. So there was this kind of historical experience that the British, by and large, did not have. The British looked at Ukraine and Ukrainians in their East European context. Canadians, in the official ranks of the government, tended to look at Ukrainians in terms more of the Ukrainian-Canadian experience. This would result in a somewhat different interpretation of how refugees should be dealt with. There were also, so when we talk about this, you have to sort of think of it as two tiers. Canadian policy following the British policy on the broad question of how to deal with Ukrainians in Ukraine, and also the added, if you like, worry, and for some bureaucrats it was a worry, as to whether or not displaced persons would be coming to Canada. So the pre-war period. Now, first of all, British policy, foreign policy towards Eastern Europe is essentially seen through Polish eyes. They had their embassies in places like Warsaw and Moscow. Although they were never pro-Soviet, they were certainly pro-Polish. And I think it goes without saying, it's very clear to most of you, that by seeing the Ukrainian question through the Polish prism, there was not only a certain amount of distortion, but there was a certain added anti-Ukrainian element. There are a number of Foreign Office reports that discuss the question of the Ukrainian minority in Halychyna or in Romania and Hungary and Carpatsko Rus and so on. Most of these written by individuals who are admittedly pro-Polish and if not anti-Ukrainian, then certainly not advocates of the cause of an independent, united Ukraine. One of the individuals who's particularly, I wouldn't say virulent, but particularly to Ukrainian obnoxious on the whole question was a man called Frank Savory. Now, despite this pro-Polish bias, the British Foreign Office did gather information from other sources. Soviet Union is one of them, and we'll discuss that a little later. So they did know about things like the pacification in 1930. They did get information from certain emigre groups in France and Belgium and in England. As some of you know, there were Ukrainian bureaus or offices, information and lobbying offices, in effect, run by various of the exile parties in England and in other places in Western Europe, and these would regularly feed information to the Foreign Office. As far as I've been able to determine whether this material came from Makahon or from Skoropadsky and his sidekick Korostovitz, it was listened to politely, but more often than not on the files you will read minutes where in fact the British discredit these individuals as witnesses. So what was the British government's policy towards Ukrainians in the pre-war period? Essentially, the British said, how can we best play what they called the Ukrainian card? In other words, how can we use the Ukrainian issue in the better interests of Great Britain? So it's an opportunistic, functional approach. They did not exhibit any particular concern for the fate of Ukrainians or for their needs. There was a certain amount of lip service in terms of the pacification and so on, how horrible this is and so on, but there was actually no real attempt to force the Poles, who were of course in close cahoots with the British on many issues, into do anything about it. They also scrupulously, and I mean made a great effort, to avoid offending the Poles or the Soviets. So in other words, we'll use the Ukrainians, we'll keep an eye on them, we'll see how things are developing, but by no means must we say anything that will get us into hot water with the Poles or the Soviets. Despite these kind of negative, if you like, impressions about the Ukrainian situation in Eastern Europe, the British were very much aware of the potential, and that's the way they phrased it, of the Ukrainian nationalist movement. For example, and I'll cite a document here, in the British Embassy of Moscow, Lawrence Collier met with Litvinov, and they discussed in general the question of Ukraine. And this happened in 1938, so a year or two before the war broke out, end of 1938. And Litvinov had this to say about Ukraine and Ukrainians and the immigration. Litvinov replied, quote, that the Soviet government, conscious of their strength, were not going to allow themselves to be unduly alarmed by the latest German boogeyman, an independent Ukraine. Now here is the beginning, in fact, of the idea that somehow Ukrainian aspirations are all a German fabrication. He asked me, that is, Litvinov asked me, if I seriously believed that the frontiers of the Soviet Union were likely to crumble at the horn blowings of a handful of Ukrainian emigres. To this, I said that I had always understood that it was something more than a mere blowing of horns. And then I added, in fact, it was nothing less than a mere blowing of horns that had caused the earthquake which brought about the collapse of the walls of Jericho. So with a little bit of cynicism, he sort of tickled Litvinov. Then he adds, in parentheses, however much Litvinov may profess calm over the Ukrainian question, there is, I think, little doubt but that the Soviet government is, naturally enough, seriously perturbed as to the possible developments in this connection. Here I think we can begin tracing, if you like, Soviet disinformation, the attempt to portray the Ukrainian people's aspirations for independence as a creation of Germany and a kind of a fear of it. So the British, of course, were very interested in that. However, and that idea, incidentally, that the Ukrainian movement was a creation of Germany was also fostered by the Poles. Now, there was no real basis in fact for that, although, as several other speakers have pointed out, Mr. Yurkevich, for example, that there were contacts between leading cadres in the German intelligence and military communities with Ukrainian nationalists. And, of course, when there was a little bit of talk about a Polish-German alliance aimed against the Soviet Union just before the war, the Ukrainian question again was of interest in that context. Now, the outbreak of World War II changes things dramatically and overnight. Poland, as we have been told, was overrun rather quickly by both the Nazis and the Soviets, and I think that's a point that bears stressing. So the British were now faced with a whole new situation, and they debated among themselves in the Foreign Office what they could do. Frank Lepper, in October of '39, shortly after the war's outbreak, lamented that the Poles had missed their golden opportunity, as he called it, to reach some kind of rapprochement with the Ukrainians and establish a federal state. But, given that Poland as such, as a state, no longer existed, the British had to consider what to do with respect to the Ukrainians. And they decided that their own interests were now far more important than those of the Poles. So remember, I'm sure most of you know, World War II, when Britain entered World War II, it was to defend the integrity of Poland, by and large. And certain promises were made. Now, well, we know how the Poles ended up after World War II. It's very interesting that at this point, October 1939, the British are saying, if the Poles don't play properly, in terms of the Ukrainian question, we won't be deterred by their susceptibilities. Quote, we will raise up the Ukrainian trouble for the Soviet government and the Germans along their common frontier. In other words, we'll play the pawn of the Ukrainians in this East European situation to destabilize both the Soviets and the Germans. And this gets more intriguing a little bit lower. But despite that, the British were very hesitant to contact the Ukrainians directly, even when representations were made from the Ukrainian side. There are a number of reasons for that. Some of them are deliberately politically motivated, others are racist. For example, Savory, who we've met earlier as being a kind of pro-Polish reporter, had this to write about Ukrainians and their leaders, who were at this time trying to make some kind of contact and reach an understanding with the British. Quote, most even of the Ukrainian leaders, A, are only just emerging from the status of semi-intellectual, and B, Ukrainians have a decidedly oriental kink of brain. Yeah. I guess that some must agree with me. Also, not only were they, let's say, dubious about whether or not you can deal with these semi-oriental, semi-intellectual types, but there was also this fear that if the British began meddling somehow with Ukrainians and the Ukrainian problem in Eastern Europe, that in fact this might force the Germans and the Soviets closer together, because after all they'd nicely split Poland and both had territorial stake in keeping it that way. They didn't want to, in other words, again rock the boat and upset either the Nazis or the Soviets. So Ukrainians, as you can see, are getting progressively shafted, and I mean that quite deliberately. They also added in parentheses, we have no way of creating trouble in Soviet Ukraine, which is the biggest piece, so what's the point in doing something in Western Ukraine? Now, this is the way things were at the early part of the war. As the, as it were, union of the Nazis and the Soviets continued, and Britain, of course, being increasingly pressured, became more and more worried, the British came up with a different perspective. And that was, well, we've got to run with the Ukrainian card. We've got to really use it. And I think it's critical to understand how they saw this. In early 1940, one Foreign Office bureaucrat wrote, if the Ukraine goes off at half-cock, I guess he presumed that it would go off when they wanted it, before we are ready, the whole thing may fizzle out. Or, if it succeeds, the Germans will just take over the whole Ukraine. Unless I am wrong, quote, and this is very important, we don't want the Ukrainian revolt before 1941 summer. Then we will use it to bring down both the Russians and the Germans. In other words, the British were seriously considering fomenting a revolt in Ukraine, in Western Ukraine, in the summer of 1941. Now, of course, the Nazis beat them to it by invading the Soviet Union. Even so, there was a caution, and this says something about the further perspective. The Allied powers, meaning England in particular, will not want, after the war with Nazism is over, to have to do more against Russia than is necessary. More especially, it will be easier and cheaper for us to enable the Poles and the Ukrainians to throw the Russians out of eastern Poland, put in quotation marks, than for us to do it by force ourselves. So what the British, in fact, were envisioning was a situation where they would foster, as they put it, a condition of perpetual sabotage in eastern Ukraine, or sorry, in eastern Poland, Galicia. And when the time was ripe, as they say, we will supply the means of guerrilla warfare, which will enable the recovery of those territories. Now, that was the plan, and as we've seen, Adolf spoiled it for them by attacking Joe. Now, the British, before this happened, however, became more and more concerned about how the Ukrainians would be treated under German administration. We've heard already about formation of auxiliary police and so on. The British believed, or some of them did, that the Germans would be the natural allies of Ukrainians in the creation of a natural Ukraine, greater Ukraine. And one of them even went so far as to write, "I do not think that we can hope the Germans will treat the Ukrainians badly." Well, surprise too for the British. As the war progressed, it became increasingly clear that Nazi policy in occupied Ukrainian territories was not only barbaric, but aimed essentially, as others have pointed out, and I need not go into it, at the destruction of the Ukrainian people. The British began to appreciate that what the Ukrainians sought was independence, whereas what the Germans, or the Nazis, sought was the economic dependence of Ukraine on the Third Reich. Files began appearing in the Foreign Office records about slave labor, the requisitioning of material goods from Ukraine, the destruction of the intelligentsia, and the destruction of the nationalist movement. So Britain began wavering in its outright kind of hesitation about the Ukrainians. Yet they did produce, as it were, one epitaph for the movement. They said it can succeed without outside help. So there's still this kind of paternalistic attitude that without us or the Germans or someone else, the Ukrainian movement is really not going anywhere. At the end of the war, they indicated that the UPA, which they were aware of, could not be expected to last because its sympathizers were being deported to Siberia, remorselessly so, and that there was an ongoing Sovietization and Russification of Western Ukraine. So they ended by saying that Ukrainian nationalism in Eastern Europe has little prospect of being anything more than a nuisance to the Soviet Union in future years of peace. In other words, with the end of the war, British attitude, British policies had shifted from being, can we use it? Well, no, we'll use it at this particular point. Well, we can't use it, but we're in trouble now because the Ukrainians and the Germans are going to be natural allies, to realizing that that wasn't the case, to assessing what the UPA might do and basically deciding to hell with it. But the Ukrainian question wasn't over for them, of course, because they had 2 to 3 million Ukrainian displaced persons, DPs, and political refugees left in the West. Now, by the terms of the Yalta Agreement, which we've heard about, most of these Ukrainians, the significant proportion of whom were Eastern Ukrainians, were sent back forcibly to the Soviet Union. But at least 250,000, and perhaps even more, were left in Western Europe. The question then becomes, what do we do with them? Well, the first trick they tried was to deny there was any such thing. There's no such thing as Ukrainian became a watchword of the occupation authorities. They would classify you as a Pole, they would classify you as stateless, they would classify you Ruthenian, they would classify everything but Ukrainian. And orders went out. Incidentally, these went out not only under British authority, but also by American authority, and the Canadians mimicked it. It is intriguing that the Canadian military, which had a large proportion of Ukrainian Canadian soldiers, was at the same time denying that there was any such thing as a Ukrainian. Now, however, you can classify people, if you like, as a subnational grouping, and that was the term they used. But it's illogical to do that when you've got, after all, 250,000 plus people telling you that that's what they are. So, what to do? Well, various schemes were contemplated, and I don't think we need to go into them now. But what became particularly effective at this point was that you had these Ukrainian Canadians, servicemen and servicewomen. They had enlisted, as I think many of us know, voluntarily and in large numbers. In fact, to the point where they, relative to the actual population composition of Canada, occupied quite a sizable chunk of the armed forces. By doing so, they'd proven their loyalty. Before World War II, there were many in Canada who mistrusted Ukrainians, saying that, well, they're more interested in what's happening in Eastern Europe than in the Canadian issues. If there's a war, who knows what side they'll go with. But these soldiers had obviously proven whose side they were on. KUK, the Ukrainian-Canadian Committee, had been organized by both the Canadian and British governments in 1940. Subsequently, KUK had set up a Ukrainian-Canadian relief fund and a Central Ukrainian Relief Bureau in London, staffed by veterans. These veterans, among whom prominent was Gordon Panchuk and others, began sending out literally thousands of letters, memoranda, reports, newspaper articles, and so on the fate of the Ukrainian refugees and DPs, who they were, what they wanted, why they were in the West. You couldn't simply ignore that. And lastly, there was a legal point. The Ukrainians, and the majority of the displaced persons who found themselves left in Western Europe were from Western Ukraine, were technically Polish citizens. Now, in that context, they were saved, because we've said that the Poles had a certain influence on British foreign policy. These were Polish citizens. You couldn't, after all, take the Anders army and send it back to Poland. Most of them didn't want to go. The Ukrainians said, well, we're Polish citizens. We don't want to go. The Polish government rather conveniently said, we don't want them. And so there was no possibility of forcible repatriation. Now, it is true that at this time, the Soviet Union began waging a very vociferous campaign to discredit the Ukrainian displaced persons. And we're still hearing it today. Ukrainian displaced persons were fascists, they were collaborators, they were Nazis, and so on and so forth. This was begun way back, in fact, even before the war ended with the Soviet denunciations of Kuk. It continued particularly after World War II. They attempted to besmirch who had started Kuk and so on. They were, I should also add, in parentheses perhaps, they were significantly aided by the pro-Soviet Ukrainian Canadian group known then as the Ukrainian Labor Farmer Temple Association, now as the Association of United Ukrainian Canadians, essentially Soviet hacks. However, what had happened that was particularly important for the refugee relief effort was that because the Soviets were protesting as bitterly as they were, CURB and the Ukrainian Relief Fund were not allowed to do anything that would be remotely construed as political. They, in other words, had to keep their relief operations strictly humanitarian distribution of relief supplies. In fact, there was even difficulties over whether they could establish a newspaper or print leaflets and so on. As, of course, the Cold War began, this attitude of feeling some concern about what the Soviets might say ebbed away. So by the end of the refugee relief and resettlement period, Soviet concerns are not influential in Canadian and British circles. But at the start, they were. So how does all this relate to, I suppose, one of the subjects that's focused all of this attention today, the Divisia Halychyna? Well, I don't want to repeat any of the history that Mr. Yurkevich and others have talked about. Suffice to say there are a few points that bear remembering. It was formed only to serve on the Eastern Front, did not take part in the suppression of the Warsaw Uprising. There is no evidence to suggest that it took part in the persecution of Jews, Slavs, or other Western Europeans. And it was, as pointed out, a Waffen or armed SS military frontline formation. Now, when it surrendered to the British, it did not do so as a Waffen SS unit. It surrendered as the 1st Ukrainian Division of the Ukrainian National Army. And on that account, they were treated somewhat differently. A new category was created, not prisoner of war, POW, rather SEP, surrendered enemy personnel. And it was in that capacity that the British moved them from Austria, where they surrendered, to Italy, into a place called Rimini. Now, near Rimini, they were kept for several years, and eventually in 1947, most of the division, the ones that in fact didn't filter out under the wire, apparently it wasn't quite a secure camp, but basically most of them, some 8,000 men, and a few dependents, incidentally, were moved en masse to England. There, they were kept for another period of about a year as POWs. In other words, they went from being surrendered enemy personnel, which is a fairly loose category. Once they were shifted to England, they became POWs. So in fact, what was done with them is that they replaced the German POWs who were being repatriated by late 47 back to Germany. So in other words, the British managed to take a whole year out of these men's lives and use them in effect as indentured labor in England. So they went to various hostels and farms and so on and performed the kind of labor at very low pay that had previously been done by German POWs. Now, it is important, and I think critically important, that you understand that in this Rimini internment period, the members of the Divisia were repeatedly screened, not only by the British, with the assistance of Ukrainian Canadians like Boshyk, and the Americans, but also by the Soviets. No evidence of any wrongdoing was discovered. Now, of course, the Soviets were loud in their denunciations of these Ukrainian soldiers, but that couldn't prove anything. There was nothing to prove. And in fact, I don't want to read the screening report to you, but Bogdan Panchuk's memoirs, in fact, reproduces the entire screening report in Heroes of Their Day, which I think they have upstairs. So if you want to read the screening report from that time by a British officer, Haldane Porter, it is in fact available, and widely so, and has been for years. Now, these men then, as I said, were moved to England. The main reason for that was that British feared that the Yugoslav and Soviet governments would bring pressure to bear on the Italian government and somehow finagle a forcible repatriation. So they were moved and screened again. The issue of admitting members of this division was brought to the attention of the Canadian cabinet around this time. It's very difficult to precisely find out when members of the Department of External Affairs first heard about the division, and perhaps it's not even all that relevant, but it was in this part, certainly some of the files I've seen begin around mid to late 1947. Quite probably Panchuk and others and then Kukwa had sent memoranda before that. But at any rate, at first, when the Canadian government considered admitting these men and other Ukrainian displaced persons, it ruled that unless they had been physically compelled to serve in the Divisia by the Germans, they were inadmissible. Not because of any crimes against humanity, but simply because they had served in German uniform. And that was a kind of a blanket restriction that applied to not just Ukrainians, but to ethnic Germans themselves. The Canadian cabinet understood that these men had served only on the Eastern Front and never against the Allies in the West, but it did make the point that the Canadian people and the Canadian government had been supplying relief and aid supplies to the USSR as an ally during World War II, so in a sense these men were indirectly fighting against Canada. And on that ground, they decided against admitting the Divisia. Now this is October of '47. They also had to keep in mind that the Soviets were particularly adamant against divisions members being allowed into Canada. The Soviet ambassadors that have been in Ottawa, in fact, stated to the Department of External Affairs that this was a political question. In fact, the admission of all displaced persons was a political question to which they attached a particular significance. Now, to their great credit, the Ukrainian Canadian Committee's representatives kept up their lobbying efforts. And again, the government was forced to reevaluate the entire question of admitting Ukrainian displaced persons to Canada, and in that, as part, the question of the Divisia. It made up a kind of a graph, for and against. And I'll read this to you in brief. The for side said, well, letting refugees in is a humanitarian act. Nobody can disagree with that. These men are good agriculturalists and skilled labor, tradesmen, and so on, and they can therefore contribute to the Canadian economy. Another good point. The Ukrainians, interesting enough, have proven to be good settlers in Canada in the past, so more of the same shouldn't be such a bad thing. And last, they are anti-Soviet and anti-communist. Again, a point in their favor. Against, a much bigger list. They fought in the German army, and we provided mutual aid to the Soviets. It's possible that some of them may be listed by the Soviets as war criminals, and there might even, in fact, be some that are war criminals by our standards. Others, it was claimed, had a better claim to being admitted. There was also the question of Canadian public opinion. Members of the cabinet felt that certain members of the Legion would be opposed to admitting anyone to Canada who had served in German uniform. Panchuk and others had made the point that members of the division, after all these years of internment and struggle and so on, had suffered grievously, and so their health was impaired. So there was this federal provincial question of, well, if we let these men in and suddenly they turn out to be a collection of bad health cases, who pays the bill? So it was kind of a jurisdictional question. A percentage, they feared, would be what they called malcontents. There might be those among them who would have relatives left in the Soviet Union, and through that, pressure could be brought to bear on these men to perform acts of spying and so on in Canada. And there was also the distinct possibility that the government feared that planted among them there might be agents. And of course, last, there was the question of the Soviet Union and its likely reaction, which they felt would be bitter. So at this point, late '47, the government again decides, no, we won't let the 8,000 men of the division now in England into Canada. And as for the other displaced persons, well, there are some things in favor of them, but we're not really sure, so let's continue our investigations. Again, as some government's documents reveal, Panchuk and his workers were, quote-unquote, working hard to change that position. Now, Canadian immigration policy developed in many different ways. There are a few books on this. We don't need to go into them. There were those that worried that if you admit too many East Europeans, you'll change the racial balance of Canada. This worked against the Ukrainians and against the Jews. There were those who said, well, even if we look at the balance here, we can allow in only certain kinds because they've proven to be better. But in the long run, the decision that was made was that these are good peasant laborers and we need them. Still, hesitation. Now, there are a number of reasons. One, the question of, are they anti-Semites? Were they connected to Ukrainian terrorist organizations? So the RCMP went off to check the facts. And meanwhile, while the RCMP did this, and the Foreign Office in England was again queried, the cabinet deferred its decision. And in fact, that's where the situation sat until 1950. Divisia is not allowable, other Ukrainians are. Now, again in 1950, the issue was raised, again by Ukrainian Canadian servicemen. The cabinet met, discussing the issue, decided that, well, these men have proven themselves to be fairly decent people. We've done repeated screenings. We find no evidence of any wrongdoing. We should let them in. However, they hesitated because they began to get protests, organized protests emanating largely from within the organized Jewish Canadian community. The first had been in December 14th of 1945, when understandably members of the Jewish community in Canada were concerned that men who, after all, were once former members of an SS unit would be allowed in. The understanding of who the division was not very clear then. 1950, things had changed. However, there were people within, or certain writers, who criticized the whole idea of allowing in Ukrainian displaced persons and refugees. Quote, Boris Smolyov in the Jewish Daily Forward, July 30th, 1950, wrote, "It is no secret that these Ukrainians who are present in Europe as refugees were all on the side of the Nazis. Moreover, a large number of them actually took part in helping the Nazis exterminate Jews. Particularly did the so-called Galician division of Ukraine distinguish itself in this regard." Now, patently an absurd statement. Samuel Bronfman, to his credit, then president of the CJC, the Canadian Jewish Congress, wrote to cabinet on this issue and urged that there be a thorough scrutiny until the government could determine exactly who these men were. Cook lobbied for the division. And in fact, there is an exchange of correspondence here which is preserved in the Public Archives of Canada, which demonstrates very clearly that there was no evidence on the side of the Canadian Jewish Congress. There was a definite, legitimate fear, concern, and so on. But as Hrycenko-Luhova, the acting secretary of Cook, wrote to the government in 1951, the CJC was prompt in lodging a protest, but when we demanded that they furnish us with evidence in support of their accusations, they remained silent. Now, the matter should have been resolved once and for all by the end of 1950, or certainly by 1951. Others found nothing wrong with the division, and those of you who managed to pick up a copy of the article that was published in the Whig Standard on February 11th as an editorial will see there a lengthy quotation from the High Commissioner for Canada in England, where he discusses the history of the division and clears them. The Foreign Office found nothing wrong, the High Commissioner for Canada found nothing wrong, the RCMP found nothing wrong, the Americans found nothing wrong, the Soviets couldn't prove anything, the CJC was effectively able to defer cabinet's decision, but it could produce no evidence. So finally, on September 25th, 1950, the Canadian cabinet cancelled its deferment order, and the immigration of members of this division to Canada was allowed. Several hundred, perhaps even a few thousand, eventually did resettle here. So what can we say? Well, by way of conclusion. First of all, over 70% of the Ukrainians who came to Canada after the war were, as you've heard, Ukrainians from Western Ukraine or Eastern Galicia, Halychyna. They were therefore legally Polish citizens, and they could not be sent back. Many of them were slave laborers, inmates of concentration camps, evacuees, and only a very small percentage, I would guess, and I underline the word guess because there's no way of being statistically significant in this respect, that far less than 0.5% were involved in actual crimes against humanity. Most were not even members of the nationalist movement, although they were probably sympathetic to it. As for the division, its 8,000 members, only several hundred to a few thousand perhaps ever came to Canada. That was only, as I've indicated, after they had been repeatedly screened by British, Canadian, and Soviet authorities, and no evidence of wrongdoing found. The legitimate concerns and I think that bears repeating, the legitimate concerns of the organized Canadian Jewish community were addressed by Cabinet and resulted in the deferment we've mentioned. So there is no way we can say today that somehow these men snuck in or they were brought in by intelligence units or something and hidden away. The issue was debated in Cabinet several times over a period of years. There was ample opportunity, number of screenings which would allow evidence to come forth, and none did, so they were legally admitted. Now, we're brought together here today in large measure because of the kind of outcry from the community in response to numerous allegations made in the press over the last 3 to 4 weeks. This outcry, or rather this outcry about alleged Ukrainians as war criminals in Canada, has been orchestrated to make it appear as if somehow these men of the division, and it's usually the division that's targeted, came in a dubious manner. I think what the paper I've just sketched out for you indicates is that's not true. So in fact, unless there's some real new evidence to suggest that Cabinet made the wrong decision, or that somehow the history of this period is not being correctly recalled here, then I would suggest that there is no need to revive the issue, and that the people who do it come either from the Soviet Union, which has every reason to want to denounce anti-communists abroad, whatever their racial, ethnic, or religious background, or is orchestrated by a few hate mongers who, for reasons of their own, profit from whipping up a kind of witch hunt mentality. So I submit to you, by way of conclusion, ladies and gentlemen, that it is in the interest of all Canadians, regardless of their background, to root out the disinformation that is currently being planted among us to divide us. Thank you.